Great, thanks, Shay. And thank you everyone for being here for the second panel of this wonderful memorial conference. My name is Shaila Wadhwani Greenhalgh. I'm a PhD student, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Alice MacLachlan from York University. She's our first speaker presenting a paper called Terror and Transformation.
Thank you so much. I've put a link to the paper in the chat if people find it easier for accessibility reasons to follow along. And I'll mostly be following the paper. So the best philosophy is always personal, but obviously today feels more personal than usual. And so in the interest of just getting through this in one piece, I'm going to save some words about Ami for the end and just dive in. I'm speaking to all of you today from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations and Métis peoples. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So Ami Baron's philosophical work addresses the nature of violence, terror, and evil, and at the same time, both the possibilities and the necessity of engaging in politics as distinct from coercion or violence, even in the face of the kind of persistent terror and other grave wrongdoings that would seem to eliminate the very conditions that enable politics in the first place. Now, while I sit more on the ethics, social philosophy side of things than political philosophy for the most part, I have been drawn to questions of specifically political reckoning with wrongdoing and specifically political repair because of a strong sense that practices like apology and forgiveness in the political sphere were being normatively mishandled, as it were, both by theorists and by popular commentators alike. So they were being treated as instances of interpersonal apology and forgiveness writ large, and then inevitably as having gone wrong in some way, instead of as distinctly political practices with a distinctly political normativity to them. And while I'd be the first to say that many or most political apologies are ripe for criticism and even condemnation, I became convinced the problem was they were being criticized and condemned for all the wrong reasons, for failing to measure up to ideals and exemplars that were all wrong for them to begin with, and were inappropriate to the context in which they were being applied. So just as an example, standards of interpersonal sincerity, affective or emotional resonance, and individual authenticity, sometimes known as crocodile tears. Among other things, this means we're not criticizing political gestures of repair in the right way for the right reasons. We're not thinking enough about what it is they're supposed to do as distinctly political acts aimed at distinctly political repair. In this way, Ami's work has always been a guiding light for me. Today, I want to, as Ami herself would put it, think with Ami on some of these themes. While I don't have time to do justice to even a little of what her philosophy has to offer us on the question of how we might best transform the destructive wake of terror and violence, I will draw out three Baronian points that are helping shape my thinking about better, more adequate ways to think about political practices of responsibility and repair. So these are, first, her account of a distinctively political normativity. Second, her emphasis on the demandingness of being accountable to the evils in which we are implicated and the limits of our individual motivational and reflective capacities. And third, her faith and commitment to the transformative power of political action, aimed at, quote, the preservation of the conditions that make talk possible. And that's really where I'm going to focus today, on the conditions that make talk possible. So first is Ami's articulation and insistence on an Arendtian normative independence for the political sphere, claiming, as she did, that we don't need to accept the binary that's so often presumed, that either politics is conceived along amoral realist lines, or it has to be evaluated by imported norms and standards from ethics and morality. In Ami's own words, I do not think that politics can or ought to be subsumed under ethics. And more specifically, I am not comfortable with a response to the problem of evil that posits morality or ethics in a regulative or even constructive role in relation to politics. I personally find her insistence on normative independence for the political sphere, especially in relationship to political evil, both refreshing and almost vertigo-inducing, something I'll come back to shortly. For Ami, politics is normative and value-laden in its own right, and these norms and values arise from and are distinctive to the political sphere. And of course, it may go without saying and may not, but in this, Ami is very much drawing on and thinking with Hannah Arendt. Second, and relatedly, I appreciate Ami's sustained attention to the overwhelming difficulties and demandingness of being accountable for evil, both individual and collective, and the fragility of morality and moral norms in the face of this demand. In her 2012 paper, Standing Between Us and Our Grave Wrongdoings, Ami reflects on Arendt's analysis of the moral disintegration that accompanied the rise of Nazism, and Arendt's own admission that she and other thinkers were, quote, trained to analyze socio-political failures and to take moral conduct for granted. While Arendt, in Thinking and Moral Considerations and her other later lectures, ultimately turns to our capacities for critical internal dialogue and for reflective judgment, a sort of mixture of conscience and integrity as a remedy to moral disintegration, Ami is more pessimistic. And here I have a longer quote from Ami. Every day, if not complicit in, I am a bystander to grave wrongdoing. Some are performed in my name. From others, I benefit economically. Others I just know of because I'm a news junkie. Even when I question myself along Arendtian lines about the moral self that I become as I go on accepting my situation on a daily basis, I am not usually motivated to do much more than I already do. Ami doesn't entirely part ways with Arendt here, but instead turns to Arendt's second remedy, our capacity not for individual moral self-critique, but rather for collective political action. And this is the third point I want to bring forward. Ami's commitment to the Arendtian model of political action as a kind of ongoing, agonistic, democratic conversation, taking place in a shared yet contested public space, and in particular, protest as one of the highest forms of that action. As she writes in Normativity, Feminism, and Politics, protest, though, more than other kinds of political action, both displays political power and has the potential of reminding people of their ability to act collectively and shape and reshape their collective life. Put differently, protest, exactly because of its display of political power, can remind people that the form of their collective life is always open to political negotiations and revisions, as well as that they can come together with others and be political agents of change. In this way, protest may be reminding people of their capacity for political freedom. I love this passage, and I love how it draws out the transformative, disruptive, imaginative, and dialogical character of political action. It's the best thing I can use to convince my students, for example, that protest is more political than voting. In protesting, for Ami, we participate in, even while challenging, an ongoing conversation about what our shared space should be. And in participating, we take a hand in shaping it. Moreover, just by entering and engaging in political space, we take responsibility for that space. And in so doing, we give ourselves a stake in it. We enact our own political freedom, which is, for Ami, quote, perhaps one of the most fragile achievements and legacies of modernity. Political freedom is renewed through popular political action and does not exist without it. Indeed, both are so fragile that we must maintain narration, stories of activism and protest to keep their possibility alive. So where do these 3 points or themes direct us when it comes to distinctly political practices of repair and responsibility, or of accountability is a better word? At the end of The Opposition of Politics and War, Ami concludes, for the Greeks to fight justly against each other meant not destroying the conditions of the possibility of talking with each other, and therefore preserving the most basic conditions of the possibility of politics, and especially some version of democratic politics. And I've excerpted here. I have come to appreciate the Greek commitment to the preservation of the conditions that make talk possible. This is, of course, Ami at her most Arendtian. When I was a graduate student reading Arendt, I didn't get it, and I found Arendt infuriating. I mean, surely there was just so much more to political justice than the mere possibility of talk. We can and do talk and talk and talk in the face of racism and sexism and violence and oppression and isn't this exactly what's wrong with academics? That we prioritize talk over the material conditions of unbearable lives? Yes and no. Since then, I've come to appreciate both the normative richness and the actual rarity of genuine conditions that make talk possible after terror and violence, and their necessity both as a precondition for and an appropriate goal of practices of repair and accountability. Thinking about talk invites us to ask different questions about what exactly needs transformation after terror. What does it mean for someone or some group to feel sufficiently secure and respected to enter into political conversation, to join the dialogue? What must be in place for them to be appropriately heard? How do we respond to challenging and disrupting interventions in ways that promote further talk? What forms of talk are even now being covered over, forgotten, and ignored? As a normative aim, preserving talk is both less and more than the ideals often taken to govern practices of repair. It's less than what we might call the prelapsarian fantasy of repair, what Marina Warner calls faith in the secular verbal magic of apology and forgiveness, and their capacity to restore us to some sort of wholeness before the wrong, the injury, the evil. So it's less, but it's also a great deal more than what many political apologies actually achieve. Moreover, the conditions for preserving talk will always vary from context to context, directing our attention to the actual concrete historical realities of time and place, and demanding that we always evaluate practices of repair contextually, a move Ami would very much approve of. The importance of talking, understood here in Baronian Arendtian terms, as the ongoing, collective, agonistic conversation enacted through political action, also highlights the limits of practices of apology, at least as apology has been conceived of thus far for accountability and repair. Apologies are traditionally successful insofar as they produce a kind of moral syllogism. A good apology is one that will be accepted, leading to forgiveness, and then reconciliation as the happy narrative ending, case closed. Additionally, insofar as apologies have been concluding narratives and end stories, they reify an authoritative version of events, the official story, the thing that got apologized for. And as Elizabeth Spellman puts it, in doing so, they foreclose further investigation. Ami and Arendt invite us to think about what an open-ended apology looks like, what an ongoing open-ended dialogical apology looks like. Finally, crucially, apologies have typically performed responsibility via a kind of catharsis for both offender and victim. The former experiences the release of confession, and the latter the relief of being acknowledged and vindicated. As an aim, I think preserving future talk directs us away from what I might call the temptations of catharsis, a tendency to overestimate the feeling that things must already be transformed following a powerful and evocative performance, that we have somehow already done the work. It redescribes accountability and repair as an ongoing negotiated transformation, always forward-looking, and not the happy ending to a gruesome story. In just a few sentences, Ami has gestured towards a model of transformation and repair as ongoing, negotiated accountability without catharsis or conclusion. Is this enough? Is this a sort of genuinely political normativity to get us to repair? Here's where my inner ethicist comes in. I find myself wanting to spell out these conditions further and relationally. What kind of relationships enable and support political action and conversation? What kind of relationships enable us to keep the stories alive? For Ami, the answer is found in an inclusive model of citizenship, appropriate citizen relationships, one that include and acknowledge are these relationships. I'm left with lingering questions about whether political relationships are sufficient, and this is the vertigo that I mentioned up top. Lisa has a story in the beginning of feminist ethics and social and political philosophy about a dog being tied up and left alone, and Lisa thinks he misses his people and Ami thinks he wants to be free. And fundamentally, I always think people miss their people, and I think that sums up where I land here. But I want to end with an illustration. Like many settler Canadians, in the wake of our first National Truth and Reconciliation Day a week ago, I have been struggling to imagine what on earth adequate practices of responsibility and repair might be in the face of my responsibility for and complicity in the evils of long-standing Canadian colonial genocidal violence against Indigenous peoples. And most viscerally, and I'm introducing a content warning here, the ongoing recovery of young children's bodies from mass anonymous graves on the sites of formal residential schools. For those of you out of Canada who may be less familiar, here's a brief recap from historians Ian Mosby and Aaron Millians. More than 150,000 children were taken from their homes between 1883 and 1997 when I started university, often forcibly, and placed in distant boarding schools where the focus was on manual labor, religious instruction, and cultural assimilation. The Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report concluded that the Indian residential school system was an attempted cultural genocide, but the escalating number of recovered unmarked graves points to something even darker. Given that more than 1,300 graves have been identified using ground-penetrating radar at only 4 of the 139 federally run residential schools, the current official number of 4,120 students known to have died in the schools will end up being only a fraction of the actual total. This was written in August, it's October. I believe the official number is now closer to 7,000. So first, as may be obvious, there is a very real sense, maybe the only sense, in which no talk is possible, that nothing can be said in the face of mass graves for children. Second, the recovery of these bodies and the fact that the Canadian media refers to them as discovered and not recovered, when Indigenous elders and survivors have been directing attention to and demanding excavation of these sites for some time, and the topic was raised in the recommendations of the TRC. This language highlights to a horrifying extent Canada's refusal to talk with, and even more to listen to, its victims. Instead, the Canadian government continues to take survivors to court to haggle over reparations. Talk of discovery also dismisses and covers over a history, stories of Indigenous political action, activism, and protest, as well as the hundreds of survivor testimonies offered in public and private to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other words, instead of aiming to preserve the conditions for talking, Canadian institutions have actively worked to eliminate them. But Ami talks about politics not as institutions, but people. And so her remarks challenge me to ask, what does it mean for me? What would it mean for individual settler Canadians to take responsibility via political action? Many of us showed up last week at community events, wearing orange shirts and ribbons, tying shoes and teddy bears to trees and fences, attending vigils and memorials. This is not political action. How could we transform these social rituals into the kind of disruptive, communicative action that Ami holds up as capable of enacting political freedom and showing us new ways of living together, giving us a better, potentially decent model of Canadian citizenship? It was about 3 a.m. last night that I realized I don't have answers, but I do have Ami's work to think with and think through this, just as she had our ends. So for now, I'm going to end with Ami's words and her conclusion to standing between us and our grave wrongdoings. On the one hand, all we have is ourselves. Yet on the other hand, what this means is we can insert ourselves between ourselves and our grave wrongdoings morally by asking, what is the future self that we are willing to live with? And especially politically, by responding to the political question about the meaning of citizenship, for me, Canadian citizenship, through political action with others, though with a historically inspired, healthy dose of suspicion about what we are doing and what we are actually contributing to. And so as I go forward, I take with me Ami's commitment, her defense of the political, and above all, her suspicion. But before I go, I have a brief postscript, and it might be more appropriate for the memorial session, but the postscript will explain why I might not be at the memorial session. So I'm going to read it now very quickly. Ami gave me so many philosophical gifts, but the greatest among them was personal. There is a real danger of sentimentality here, but in rereading as much of Ami's work as I could possibly get my hands on over the last few months, I realized how deeply all of her philosophy was infused with and interwoven with, as she herself wrote, her own self and her life conditions. So I don't think it does a disservice to her philosophy to steal a little time and end by sharing how profoundly Ami shaped my life conditions. When I first attended Feast in 2007, I met Ami and Lisa for the first time, and their daughter Yuval was with them. It sounds silly to my own ears now, since my life and my neighborhood are chock full of them, but they were the first two-mom family I ever saw in real life. Even now, I remember how fascinated and nosy I was. I couldn't stop stealing glances, looking around, watching them, and experiencing something full and deep pulling at me, despite at that time a fair degree of ambivalence about having kids of my own with my then girlfriend and now wife. Hannah Arendt reminds us how important exemplars are for judgment, performing an illustrative task that neither the universal nor the particular can achieve, by illuminating human virtues even in the darkest times. For the last 14 years, Ami and Lisa have been, in a very real way, my first exemplars of philosophical mothering, and in particular, co-mothering. In the spring of 2011, I gave a colloquium talk at Binghamton. I drove down 6 hours and stayed with Ami and Lisa, feeling just a little intimidated as a junior scholar to be hosted by two role models whom I'd only spoken to a handful of times. But the first night, I sat with Ami at her table. I think Lisa had a Hebrew class, actually, and just talked and talked and talked for hours. A little about philosophy, but mostly about her family, me, and my then ambivalent hopes for mine. I can't remember exactly what changed that night, but something did, and I drove home 6 hours the next day with entirely new resolve. My wife and I began a somewhat arduous process of trying to conceive shortly after that. When I next saw Ami at Mass in July 2012, I was 7 weeks pregnant and was not telling anyone yet. Ami walked right up to me, looked in my face, and just said, "So it worked, you're pregnant." And I lost my composure instantly. As a result, she and Lisa were actually among the very first people to know, well before my own family or my in-laws. And I have always felt, and Ami, please forgive me the religious metaphysics here, that I had not just role models, but guardian angels of same-sex parenting in Binghamton. And it's not actually an exaggeration to say that I'm not sure I'd have the family I do today if I hadn't gone there in 2011. Which brings me to the very last time I talked to Ami in March 2020, at the very beginning of the pandemic. My eldest daughter had been going through a really awful time, and thus so was I. I felt helpless and incompetent and scared, and I was only beginning to realize that I wasn't hearing and couldn't hear what my child was telling me. I hadn't seen who she was, and so I hadn't been the parent she needed, and it was the worst feeling I've ever had. And suddenly, out of the blue, for the first time in almost 2 years, there was Ami on Facebook Messenger, reaching out with her usual unerring directness, ready as ever to hear my worst fears without telling me everything would be okay or trying to pacify me, but just focusing me on the next steps, addressing what needed to be done and attending to praxis. Since she died, I've gone back to that conversation several times, worrying that Facebook will have somehow deleted it, and always wishing it hadn't ended with her checking in on me again and me too busy with early pandemic homeschool and online teaching to respond. Her last question to me still hangs there. Are you okay? I don't know how Ami always knew, but I am so grateful that she included me in this wide sphere of her fierce generosity, and I feel her loss rather desperately. Ami, thank you for your philosophy, and thank you for my family.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing, Alice. We have time to take 1 or 2 questions specifically for Alice's talk after a wonderful round of applause, and send hearts. And then we will turn to Yasmin's paper. So if there are any questions, you may type them into the chat, or raise your hand with the raise hand function. Shay has a question.
I always wait for other people to ask questions, and then when they hesitate, I jump on.
You will inspire others.
One of the things that I don't think that I heard you say is the word forgiveness. And like the whole time I was like, and then forgiveness. No. And then no. Okay. So I guess and I know that I've read quite a bit of your work on forgiveness and its relationship to political repair. But I guess I'm wondering how you think maybe Ami would, or maybe y'all have talked about this, right? So how or whether Ami saw anything like your conception of forgiveness as useful in these ethical political circumstances of repair, like the TRRC.
Yeah.
Because of how strictly she held the distinction between ethics and politics, and how I know that you're more flexible with this, I would be interested to know how your work with political kinds of forgiveness mingles with Ami's work that probably wouldn't even want to hear the word, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, she wouldn't want to hear the word except for Hannah Arendt, of course, because Hannah Arendt locates forgiveness first and foremost in the sphere of political action. But I think what Arendt is talking, part of the reason I don't use forgiveness, even though I mean Arendtian forgiveness, is I think most of us bring a whole wealth of interpersonal associations to the term forgiveness. Immediately people start thinking about overcoming anger, sort of overcoming resentment, sort of rebuilding a personal relationship. And, you know, if I hadn't decided to sacrifice time to talking about something I needed to say, I might have gone on to talk a little bit about Arendtian forgiveness and how actually I think it fits this model of sort of forward-looking, preserving talk and accountability. Because for Arendt, forgiveness is what stops the cycle of violence and introduces something, what stops the sort of cycle of revenge, violence, and opens up something new. There's actually very little of the sort of warm and fuzzy talk of forgiveness in Arendt. It's much more about just sort of a break, a sort of release from the ways in which we're trapped in our own culpability and the potential of moving forward to something else. I have stopped talking about forgiveness when it comes to settler Indigenous relationships, because I think it is my responsibility as a settler not to introduce that. And I find that so many Canadians are so anxious to get to the forgiveness part of reconciliation. There's this sense that, oh, well, you know, and Elizabeth Spellman talks about this, the apology is the subpoena, and once you've given it, then it's time for the forgiveness, you know, bring it in. I did my part, now it's on you. And I think that it's a bit like the way that Ami says terrorism is evil, but we have to be careful of talking about it as evil because it's starting to become treated as a synonym for political reasons. I think forgiveness is crucial to repair, but we have to be careful about talking about it because it's become a synonym for the kind of a model of repair that says the past is over, it's shut down, stop complaining, stop whining, we can move on now. And so even though I don't think that's what genuine and particularly sort of imperfect forgiveness does, or political forgiveness, I've moved away from the term in many ways. I find that I can get more at the models of repair and accountability that I want by avoiding it. And that's maybe something I need to think more about and sort of face up to, but that hence the silence.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yes, Shannon Buckley, thank you.
Hello, Alice. Nice to
Hello,
start.
Shannon.
This is more of a general comment, and it's probably to anybody who's going to have something to say about conversations and the conditions for. We do a lot of talking about talking. We need to do more talking about listening and what that means in a political context. It's just a comment. I don't know whether this is something you think about when you talk about. Let's get these conditions right for getting the conversation going. And, you know, we all do this. Everybody here is probably doing it. Well, we'll try and listen. But anytime we want to ask a question, we're jumping ahead to that. So it's more of a comment. Really nice talk. And you had me a little choked up at the end.
I'm sorry, everyone. Yeah, that was, Arendt would talk about the inappropriate importation of emotions into the political sphere here, and basically Rousseau at this point. I think you're right. I would like to recommend a recent book that came out by Warren Haidt called An Ethics of Attention. And he draws on Simone Weil, among others. And I think that if you want to read really deep philosophical work about the importance of listening and attending and understanding how just paying attention in itself is an ethical act, I would start with Warren's work and go up from there. It's certainly influenced me a great deal. And I think that Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think that there's pretty good evidence that instead of like the conditions that make talk possible, first and foremost among them has to be the capacity to listen. And I think Canadian institutions and individual Canadians have made it pretty clear that we don't want to and won't and can't. And as both a philosopher and a Canadian, I sort of have I'm doubly guilty here.
We're both the same then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful.